All right, buckle up for a deep dive into a chapter of history that is pretty wild when you think about it. We're going to be talking about how convicts shipped from Britain ended up laying the foundation for modern-day Australia.
It's a story that really makes you think about how societies define crime, right? And the consequences that follow.
Yeah,
We're looking at excerpts from an article. It's on the National Museum of Australia website.
okay.
The title is Convict Transportation Peaks.
Yeah.
And it is packed with details that are just gonna, well, they'll make your jaw drop.
All right, so give me some of those jaw-dropping details. What kind of numbers are we talking about here?
Okay, so picture this. In 1833, almost 7,000 convicts arrived in Australia.
Wow.
And that's just 1 year.
Yeah.
Out of a period spanning from 1788 to 1868,
Okay.
during which, get this, over 162,000 individuals were transported. It's hard to even fathom the scale of it all.
That's just an incredible amount of people. It really puts things in perspective, especially when you think about the logistical challenges, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just moving that many people across the world
Exactly.
in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah, and remember, this wasn't just a one-way ticket.
Oh, interesting.
Britain's penal system was really deeply intertwined with the development of Australia.
So let's unpack that a bit. Why transportation in the first place?
Right.
What was going on in Britain that led to such a drastic measure?
Well, to understand that, you kind of have to step back in time a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Go back to 18th century Britain.
Okay.
The penal system was incredibly harsh,
Yeah.
with the death penalty being a very common sentence
Well.
for even what we would consider today, minor offenses.
Right.
The article mentions there were something like 225 capital offenses.
225 offenses.
Yeah, I mean, think about that. Stealing a loaf of bread could land you on the gallows.
Wow. 225. I mean, today we debate the death penalty for the most serious crimes. And even then, it's a complex ethical issue.
Right?
To think that it was so widespread for what we would consider petty theft.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know, it's almost unimaginable.
Yeah, it certainly challenges how we think about these things today. I mean, for sure. And that's why transportation, although undeniably brutal, was seen by some as a more humane alternative to execution.
Right. Okay, so transportation was on the table. But where were these convicts initially being sent?
Well, the primary destination was the American colonies. In fact, a thriving business developed around convict labor in America.
So these convicts, I mean, deemed criminals, shipped off as punishment, ended up playing a key role in the development of a nation that, well, that would later champion freedom and independence.
Right.
That has got to be one of history's greatest ironies.
It's a point that historians often bring up, for sure. But, of course, this arrangement couldn't last forever.
Right.
The American Revolution threw a massive wrench into the works.
Yeah, right. No more America. So where did Britain turn to next?
Well, you have to imagine British prisons were overflowing. They were using decommissioned ships called prison hulks to house the extra convicts. And the conditions were, well, absolutely deplorable. They desperately needed a new solution. And that's where Australia enters the picture.
Now, the article mentions two figures who were really instrumental in this shift, James Muttra and Joseph Banks.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about them?
Absolutely. So Matra had sailed with James Cook, to the Pacific, and he had seen Botany Bay firsthand. He believed that it would be perfect for a penal colony. And Banks, he was a prominent botanist, a very famous explorer.
Right.
And he backed him up.
So Botany Bay becomes the new destination. Was the plan always to make Australia a penal colony? Or was there something else in the works?
Initially, there was some talk of sending British loyalists who wanted to leave America after the Revolution.
Okay.
But the focus quickly shifted. Convicts became the priority.
And so in 1787, the first fleet set sail from Portsmouth, carrying over 750 convicts, plus Marines and administrators. This wasn't just a voyage. It was the birth of a nation. And at the helm of this fleet was Captain Arthur Phillip, the newly appointed governor of New South Wales.
Philip's story is fascinating. He wasn't just a military man, just overseeing a penal colony. He genuinely believed in the possibility of rehabilitation.
Oh, wow.
He envisioned this colony as a place where convicts could potentially turn their lives around.
So while punishment was obviously a driving force, there was also this idea of building something new, something better, woven into the very fabric of the colony's origins.
Yeah, exactly. But Philip's role was incredibly complex.
I can imagine.
I mean, he had to balance the need for punishment with the goal of, establishing a functioning society,
Yeah.
a thriving society. He was quoted as saying, "There can be no slavery in a free land."
What a powerful statement, given the circumstances. And what does that tell us about the reality of convict life in this new colony? It couldn't have been easy.
Absolutely not. We'll delve into the specifics a bit later, but it's important to remember that convicts' life was incredibly harsh.
Okay, so let's pause here for a moment.
Yeah.
We sort of set the stage. Britain's overcrowded prisons, the search for a new penal colony, the arrival of the First Fleet in Australia, but we've only scratched the surface.
When we come back, we'll dive into, the nitty-gritty of convict life, the
Right.
labor systems that emerged, and how this seemingly undesirable population ultimately shaped the nation we know as Australia. Stick with us, folks. This story is about to get really, really interesting.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Australia's convict history. Before the break, we were talking about the sheer scale of transportation. Thousands of convicts shipped across the world.
Right.
It makes you wonder, what kinds of crimes were these people actually committing?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, because you might picture, hardened criminals, but the reality was much more complex.
Oh.
A lot of these convicts were from Britain's rapidly growing cities,
Yeah.
places where poverty and displacement were rampant.
So we're not necessarily talking about hardened criminals in the sense that we might imagine them today.
Exactly. The article points out that theft, for instance, was incredibly common. People were struggling to survive, just stealing food and clothing out of sheer desperation.
And that could lead to transportation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A conviction for stealing even a relatively small item could result in 7 years transportation to the other side of the world.
7 years.
It really makes you think about the social and economic pressures that contribute to what we even label as crime, right?
It's a stark reminder that the line between criminal and victim can be, it can be incredibly blurry.
Oh, yeah.
Especially when you factor in historical context. Were there any other factors that that might surprise us?
Well, one thing that might challenge our assumptions is that about 20% of those convicted were women.
Wow, I hadn't even considered that. It seems like the history of convict transportation is often told from a very male perspective.
Right.
What were the experiences of these women like?
Well, that's a whole other deep dive waiting to happen. But it's crucial to remember that transportation impacted entire families, not just the men who were convicted.
Right.
I mean, women were often transported for crimes like theft, but their experiences were very much shaped by their gender roles.
Of course.
The societal expectations of the time.
Okay, so we've got this picture of poverty and desperation driving a lot of these crimes that led to transportation. But were there also convicts who committed what we might consider, more serious offenses?
Of course, yeah. There were definitely individuals convicted of violent crimes, arson, and other offenses that would carry serious penalties even today. But even within those categories, there's another layer of complexity.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, the article mentions political prisoners.
Oh, interesting.
These were people who, they challenged the status quo, advocated for social change, and often found themselves on the wrong side of the law.
So basically dissenters, people who challenged the British establishment.
Precisely. We're talking about individuals like Irish Home Rule insurgents, the Tolpuddle martyrs who fought for workers' rights, Luddites who opposed industrialization, and even Chartists who demanded political reforms.
It's fascinating to consider that people who were, in essence, fighting for a better world were lumped in with common criminals.
Yeah.
It really makes you question how history is written,
Right.
and whose voices get amplified.
And it certainly highlights how power dynamics influence who gets labeled a criminal,
Yeah.
and whose actions are deemed acceptable. And it makes you wonder how history might have unfolded differently if these individuals hadn't been shipped off to Australia.
Right. I mean, they contributed to the development of Australia, but at what cost to their own aspirations?
Right.
And the movements they represented back in Britain.
Exactly.
It's a thought-provoking question for sure. So let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about who these convicts were, but what about their legacy? How did a nation built by people, deemed undesirable by Britain, ultimately become the thriving country we know today?
Well, for starters, you got to remember, these convicts were the ones building the infrastructure of the colony.
Right.
I mean, they built roads, bridges, public buildings, the very foundations upon which a modern society could be built.
It's easy to overlook that, isn't it?
Yeah.
We tend to focus on the punishment aspect of transportation.
Right.
But these convicts were literally shaping the physical landscape of Australia.
And their labor wasn't limited to public works. I mean, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of convicts chose to stay in Australia after serving their sentences.
Yeah.
They became settlers, farmers, business owners, integral members of the community.
So they weren't just building the infrastructure, they were building lives for themselves,
Exactly.
putting down roots, contributing to the growth of a new nation.
Precisely. And in doing so, they helped shape the very character of Australia.
I see.
Its independent spirit, its work ethic, its cultural diversity. Remember, these were people who had been uprooted, transported across the world, forced to start over in a completely alien environment.
Yeah.
And yet, they persevered.
That resilience is incredible. The article also highlights that under Governor Macquarie, some former convicts were even appointed to key positions in the colonial government.
That's right.
What does that tell us about how attitudes towards convicts evolved over time?
Well, it suggests a gradual shift, I think.
Yeah.
A recognition that former convicts could not only contribute to society, but even hold positions of authority.
Wow.
It's a powerful testament to the possibility of redemption and the evolving nature of social perceptions.
Yeah, it also speaks to the idea of second chances, of recognizing the potential in people even after they've made mistakes.
Yeah.
But I imagine there were still plenty of challenges and prejudices to overcome.
Oh, absolutely. The legacy of the convict past it's complex, it's nuanced. It's a story of hardship and resilience, of punishment and redemption, and it continues to shape Australian identity to this very day.
It's a reminder that history isn't always black and white. It's full of gray areas, uncomfortable truths, and unexpected outcomes.
Yeah, and it challenges us to think critically about how we view those who have been marginalized or labeled as criminals in our own society.
That's a powerful point. We often hear the phrase, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Right.
But I think it's equally important to remember that the past can teach us valuable lessons about compassion, about understanding, and the potential for change.
For sure.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's still so much more to explore.
When we come back, we'll delve into the system of convict labor that fueled the colony's growth, the harsh realities and the surprising opportunities that shaped the lives of these transported individuals. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our final segment where we're exploring how convicts shaped Australia. We've talked about the reasons behind transportation, the sheer scale of it, the diverse backgrounds of those who were transported, but now let's actually delve into the heart of their experience, the system of convict labor that really fueled the colony's development.
What's really fascinating here is that it wasn't just about brute force or mindless toil. It was actually a surprisingly structured system.
Oh.
Yeah, with convicts assigned tasks based on their skills, their trades.
So there was an element of organization and even specialization within this system. That's not what usually comes to mind when you think about convict labor.
Exactly. And remember Governor Phillip, who we talked about earlier. Well, despite the harsh conditions, he really believed that work could be a path to redemption for these convicts. He saw what he called honest sweat as a means of, instilling discipline and a sense of purpose.
So it wasn't just about punishment for its own sake. There was this element of rehabilitation woven into the fabric of convict labor.
Precisely. It's a complex, often contradictory aspect of this history. On the one hand, you have the brutal reality, forced labor, the harsh punishments, the deprivation of freedom. But on the other hand, you have this idea that work could be transformative, a way for convicts to rebuild their lives and contribute to this emerging society.
It makes you wonder about the psychological impact of this, right?
Oh, yeah.
On the convicts themselves. Did they internalize this idea of work as redemption? Did they resist it? I imagine it probably varied greatly from person to person.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember that the experience varied, depending on the individual, the nature of their crime, and, honestly, just the whims of those in authority. Some convicts were assigned to government projects like road building or construction. Others were assigned to work for free settlers, providing labor on farms or in households.
So there wasn't just one monolithic convict experience.
Oh, yeah.
It was a tapestry of individual stories, each shaped by very unique circumstances.
Exactly. And as we talked about earlier, there was a hierarchy within the system with opportunities for convicts to earn their freedom through hard work and good behavior. Those who proved themselves could earn a ticket of leave, which was It was kind of like a conditional parole.
Okay.
It granted them a degree of freedom. There were also conditional pardons and even the possibility of land ownership,
Wow.
particularly under Governor Macquarie, who, as you might recall, was known for his somewhat progressive views
Mhm.
on convict rehabilitation.
So within this system of punishment, there were also these glimmers of hope, these opportunities for convicts to create a new life for themselves.
Yes. And it's these individual stories,
Yeah.
these triumphs over adversity that really make this history so compelling. The article mentions a letter from Reverend Richard Johnson.
Okay.
It was written in 1794, and Johnson had observed that many convicts who had served their sentences, well, they actually chose to stay in Australia.
Really?
They were thriving, becoming successful settlers, farmers, business owners. He even compares them favorably to farmers back in England, suggesting that that they were doing quite well for themselves in this new environment.
That's amazing. It really speaks volumes about their resilience,
Yeah.
and their adaptability to think that they were, uprooted, transported across the world, branded as criminals, and yet they were able to not only survive but thrive in this new land.
Yeah, it's a testament to the human capacity for adaptation,
Yeah.
and the power of hope, even when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. And it's a reminder that history is full of unintended consequences. I mean, what began as a system of punishment ultimately laid the groundwork for a whole new nation.
It's incredible when you think about it. Convicts sent to the other side of the world in chains ended up shaping the very fabric of Australian society. Their labor, their skills, their resilience, I mean, they're all woven into the tapestry of the nation's history.
And that legacy, well, it continues to resonate today. It's a story that sparks important conversations about justice, about rehabilitation, and the nature of second chances. It challenges us to look beyond labels and recognize the inherent worth of every individual, regardless of their past mistakes.
And it prompts us to think about how we view our own history, the uncomfortable truths we might need to confront, and the lessons that we can learn from the past as we try to build, a more just and equitable future.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive today. We've explored the intricate web of history that led to the transportation of convicts to Australia, and how those individuals, those deemed undesirable, ultimately played a pivotal role in shaping the nation's development. We hope this journey has shed some light on a fascinating and often overlooked chapter in human history, and maybe even sparked your curiosity to delve even deeper into the lives and experiences of those who were shipped and shaped a new world.